So if you're a indie game developer, an indie filmmaker, a whatever you're doing, there's going to be a point where you need to animate something. Somebody's going to have to do that, and it's probably not going to be a dedicated professional animator because you're working either alone or in a small team. So that's why you're watching this video, to improve your own animation skill. And we're going to go over 5 basic but very, very important tips that's going to help you realize what you should be paying attention to and what will make the most amount of difference in improving your animation early on in your journey of learning to animate. Largely, this should work for 2D, 3D, regardless of what software you're using. I will specifically be showing this in 3D with Blender though. And the first tip is one that you've probably already heard quite a lot, and that is use a reference of the thing you're animating. If you're animating an animal running, like a running dog or a running horse or whatever, look up videos. Have the videos open and go through them frame by frame to understand how the movement works. While you're animating, keep looking back and forth at it. Does your animation look like the reference you're trying to recreate? Ideally, you want to have the same movement shot from a couple of different angles as well. If you're doing a humanoid character, you're in luck because you can just grab your phone, film yourself doing the movement you're trying to animate. It's preferable to shoot from both the face-on perspective and a side profile perspective so that you have some 3D awareness of what's going on with the movement and your body. And if you're doing that while you're making your own reference, we can actually move on to tip number 2, because tip number 2 is about how you then take that and put it into a timeline to move forward with animating that thing. Because what are you going to do? Are you going to just put that frame for frame and try to recreate that? Because that is a horrible idea. What you do is, and that's why we have this here in Blender, is you get the key poses from that movement and you build those first. Then you can go back and add in between frames. This is how 2D animation has been working for years. You create the most important frames first, and then you add in other frames as needed. So for this sword swing, we start in this wound up position. Then we have a little anticipation here where we wind up even more. Then we have the actual swing itself, which ends about here. And then we have a little bit of overshoot, because if you're swinging the sword around that quickly, it's not going to abruptly stop moving. So this entire animation is broken down into 4 key poses. Those are the first ones I made, and then I started going back over them and tweaking things and adding in all these extra keyframes for specifically the swing itself to look nice and snappy. But adding a bunch of different keyframes can still actually be not ideal. In this case it was, but in a lot of cases you don't actually want to add a lot of keyframes, because if you don't want to change something, that's going to be a pain. That brings us to this other animation file that I've got here, because we're going to be, instead of just looking at the keyframes themselves, which you might be familiar with at this point, this entire swinging animation that I've got here, it's only really got a handful of keyframes, but there's a nice weightiness to the swing. And if I were to do this manually with keyframes, I would need a absolutely ridiculous amount of keyframes, and it would be a pain to change anything around at any time. And if I want to change the timing, that's going to be an even bigger nightmare. So what we do is we use a graph editor. We use curves instead to influence the timing and weightiness of the movement. So if we grab these curves over here, we can see we can actually change the way it interpolates between the keyframes by dragging these handles around, making it so that there is a bit of quick movement, and then we hang around a little bit with almost no movement at all before swinging back down with a much faster movement yet again. If I had to do this with keyframes, we would have these 2 keyframes here, but we'd probably also have a keyframe here, and probably one around here, and probably one around here, and one around here. And even then it would still not be as smooth as what we have right now, because having these Bezier curves is a very smooth way to interpolate between keyframes to begin with. Another big upside of this is that if we want that overshooting that we had in the previous animation in something like this swing, these curves can actually do that without adding new keyframes as well. So if we just drag up this handle quite a bit here, and then we also drag up the handle of the other keyframe, we can see that this curve actually dips below the value that this keyframe will eventually have, and then the curve also peaks above the value of the next keyframe, which allows you to overshoot your actual keyframe positions. Which again, that helps with making the animation feel more grounded, more weighty. It respects physics a lot more. And there's going to be some trial and error trying to get used to using these curves. But once you get used to using this, it's going to save you a lot of headache and it's going to improve your animations a lot. And for tip number 4, we're back with our sword wielding dude here. Because this is something that I want to show you real quick. This is at the moment 33 frames long, and this preview will play at around 30 frames per second. So this entire swing will take about 1 second, which might sound really, really fast, but it's not. That doesn't feel very powerful. And that's because about 99% of the animations that you're going to be making as a beginning animator are going to be too slow. Movement happens faster than you think. Now, this animation is supposed to play at 60 frames per second, as you might be able to see over at the right-hand side of the screen here. It doesn't quite do that, so what we're going to do instead is I'm going to scale this animation to be twice as fast, and this is the actual playback speed of what the animation should look like, which is just so much better, right? There isn't much to explain here other than the fact that if your animation doesn't feel quite right, you might want to play with the timings of the poses themselves, but generally just speeding up your animation tends to improve the feel and look of it quite a lot for beginning animators. 9 times out of 10, you are better off going a little bit faster than you might think, rather than slowing down an animation. There is such a thing as an animation that's too fast to the point where the viewer or the player, if it's a game, isn't able to tell what the hell the animation is and what is going on. But you need to push your animations to a ridiculous length before they get to the point where they actually are generally considered to be too fast. And with that, I think we can move on to the last and probably the most important tip I've got for you guys today. Try to understand the body mechanics of what you're doing and try to understand the physics of how a movement is generated and what the purpose of a movement is. So for this sword swing, for instance, the idea for a sword swing is that you generate energy that you transfer through your sword into your enemy. And if your character is just standing still and with a stiff arm swinging around the sword without any wind up, without any anticipation, that doesn't convey the fact that energy is being generated and transferred, which means that it's going to be a very bad swinging animation. This animation, it starts in a fairly wound up position already, but the first movement is actually the character winding up even more to sell the fact that we are trying to store up this energy that's going to get released very, very quickly. So the energy that this sword will eventually travel with is being generated through winding up the body. The body itself is rotating quite a bit. I mean, this is the forward axis here. The body is facing almost 90 degrees to the other side. And once we've finished winding up, potentially even more, because it's not just the body working here. We're also winding up the arm and hinging the wrist. Inside of the swing itself, all of that unwinds and releases the energy, creating a very, very powerful looking swing, which again has a little bit of overshoot because you're swinging around a huge piece of metal with quite a lot of energy. You're going to overswing. By no means am I an expert in sword fighting, but as an animator, this is the kind of thing that you need to be looking at. What is the purpose of my animation, and how do the body mechanics of my character work to generate the movements that are needed? Right now I don't have an example of a jumping animation, but a jumping animation would require your character going down through their knees a little bit before springing up. because the upward momentum that you need to make a jump mostly comes from a bending of the knees. I'd like to refer you to my video on making a walking animation. That doesn't necessarily go too deep into the body mechanics side of things, but it does cover the usual poses that we use and has some references for making a walking animation. That actually goes over quite a few of the topics that we've talked about here today. I hope this video has been helpful. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. All that like shameless plugging YouTuber stuff. And maybe I'll make a follow-up video to this in the future with some more animation related tips. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page.